prefer that.
5:30 each day?
They go with me, Judge.
Well, how far behind are you?
At least a half day.
Well,
Probably
we've lost it. I mean, everybody rise for the jury? Okay, we can be seated. You want to get Mr. Clayton, please? Mr. Clayton, come on back up. You're still under oath. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Mr. Clayton, during the recess, I laid out some photos on the witness stand there. And what I'd like to do is work with you to move from your left to right, talking about those photos. Any questions, or are we good?
Not yet, yeah.
And turning your attention to what's been previously marked as defendant 1052, 1170, and 1171, I'd ask you to look at those. Those are the first ones on your left. They're in a stack. I can show you where they are, sir. Yeah, those three.
Oh.
I'd ask you to look at those ones and see if they accurately reflect how that room looked when you conducted your investigation on November 29th, 2012.
Yes, they do.
Okay. Move for admission of 1052, 1170, 1171.
Any objection?
So, Your Honor, my understanding, defense provided me with all of these. I believe the entire stack are those FBI photos that were provided in discovery. If that's the case, I'd stipulate to all of them coming into evidence.
Okay. That'll speed us up. So anytime you talk about stuff, we'll just admit them. But
Okay.
you'll have to go a little slow so I can keep up because they're not in order.
And I'll be sure and say the numbers when I'm talking about them,
Please do.
by all means. Turning your attention, and I'm going to ask for an ongoing order to publish these as I go through them. Thank you. I'm going to ask you to look at the top one on that little stack, defendants 1052. Safe to say that's one of the bedrooms on the first floor of Mr. Mark Redwine's house, correct?
It is a room on the first floor, yes.
Right. And it's a room that, as you described yesterday, you investigated looking for biological evidence, correct?
That is correct.
And I think you even testified yesterday that you took a shirt out of that room, or maybe you didn't take it out of the room. You tested a shirt from that room with luminol, correct?
Luminol or phenolphthalein, I'm not sure which one.
Right. It was either luminol or phenolphthalein, and both of those are presumptive tests for blood, correct?
That is correct.
And either the luminol or the phenolphthalein, when applied to the shirt from this room on defense 1052, came back presumptively negative for blood, correct?
That is correct.
And safe to say you went through your exacting process to look for biological evidence, including stains, weapons, areas of interest in this photo, correct?
That is correct. I searched this room.
And you did not find any evidence of a bloodletting incident or any violent incident in that room, correct?
That is also correct, yes.
Turning your attention to 1170. Same room, different corner, safe to say?
Just a different view of that. If you orient yourself to the flag hanging on the wall or the window, you can see the change in angle.
Right. If got the NASCAR flag on the viewer's right, different part of the room there, correct?
Correct.
And again, consistent with your investigation.
Mr. Bogan, you've already established nothing of interest in this room. Okay, you can establish it once, and you can show the pictures, and ask a few questions, but don't have to.
Okay. This is the same room that you just testified to, correct?
That is correct.
Turning your attention to 1171.
Yes,
With
sir.
closet in the room was subject to your same investigation and same conclusion, correct?
That is correct.
Turning your attention to the next stack of photos that the parties have stipulated to admission. Those being defendants 1069, 1068, 1172.
Go ahead, whenever you're ready.
Does that look like one of the rooms you investigated and searched on November 29th, 2012, correct?
Yes, it is.
And you described that as a closet or a laundry room, or?
Has a washer and dryer in it. It also has an area that you can hang clothing and on the floor or some shoes. So I would call it a laundry room.
Fair enough. And do you recall the location of this in the house being upstairs in the house?
Yes, it was upstairs, accessible from the hallway.
And did you collect any biological information from this room?
I did swab, but I didn't find anything of evidentiary value in this room.
Okay. Different angle, same room, correct? I'm sorry, and I should say, turning your attention to defendants 1068.
Yes, that's still the laundry room, just a different angle.
Okay. And this, again, this room falls into the unremarkable, no evidence seized category, correct?
That's how I would describe it, as unremarkable.
One more for this room, 1172. And can you describe for the jury what you see on what appears to be the drying machine, dryer, on the left there on top of it?
There's a number of canisters or containers. One of them, or two of them, I guess one of them looks like bleach. One of them looks like detergent. There's a bag, a plastic bag, and a couple of cans, dryer sheets, things that would be consistent with a laundry room.
Right. And you've already testified you didn't seize or find any biological evidence in here, even though you did a swab, right?
Okay, that's the third time you've asked the question on the same room. Don't do it again.
Moving on to the defendants 1070, 1071. Are you looking at 1070?
I have that, yes.
Safe to say that's the upstairs bathroom?
That is correct.
And by the same, and let's now seeking to publish 1071. Different angle, same room, correct?
That is correct.
And you did not find anything remarkable. What were your conclusions regarding this room in your search for biological evidence?
Nothing of apparent evidentiary value was noted.
You also analyzed the upstairs master bedroom, correct?
That is correct.
Turning your attention to 1173, 1066, 1174. Can you describe for the jury what we see here in 1173, please?
On this photo, you can see the letter K has been affixed to the wall. That's an FBI acknowledgement of what room they're using. It's on like a little sticky note with a Sharpie, just the letter K. It also has a scale built into it so you can see somewhat of the dimensions. You can see the foot end of the master bedroom, the master bed, normal clothes just lying about. The bed is not made. Clearly a window, and the door leads to, I believe, a small porch with an exit stairway out of that room. You can also see the dresser there. This is kind of from the hallway looking into this room.
Turning your attention to 1066. Do you recall where that is in the house?
This is a reverse angle of the room we were just in. You can see on the right-hand side the laundry room. There's a hamper. Then you see the master bath door is open. You can see partially down the hallway, and the stairwell is kind of on the left side, the right side of the photograph. So this is just a reverse angle of the same room we were just in.
Turning your attention to 1174. Does this exhibit give a different view of the same room, and please describe?
It's a slightly different angle. It's not uncommon to overlap photographs when you're photographing, so you have something in common. Once again, you can see the laundry room door on the extreme right. You can see the laundry room is exposed. The clothing that was on the floor, the dresser, and the exit door from the master bedroom. You can just see a corner of the bed, master bed on the left-hand side, bottom of the photograph.
Did you collect anything of, in your opinion, evidentiary significance from this room?
No, I did not. Nothing of evidentiary value was noted.
Turning your attention to defendants 1019, stipulated to admission. What do you recall that being part of at the house?
That's the crawl space of the house. I was not involved in the examination of this area.
You did not do any work on the crawl space?
I did not go there.
Didn't look at it?
No.
So you weren't asked to apply any luminol or phenolphthalein to that area?
I did not go in that area, no. Did you investigate any of the areas outside the house?
Visually only.
Okay. And did that include a shed and a kind of motorhome?
I looked inside of those, but I did not go inside of those to the best of my knowledge. I simply did a visual examination from a doorway. The actual examination of those areas, I think, was FBI, not me.
I'd turn your attention to defendants 1026.
Does that look like the camper RV that you observed from the outside?
That is correct.
And did you collect any evidence from the outside or inside of that?
I did not.
And you've already testified that you did not collect any evidence from the shed that was outside as well, correct?
That is correct. I did not examine the shed except visually.
Drawing your attention back to the upstairs, I'd like you to look at defendants 1175, please. Do you recall investigating that part of the upstairs area?
Yes, this is opposite of the master bedroom, the other end of the hall.
And what do we see to the right of what looks like a comfortable chair?
Some sort of recliner and some clothing and a trash can with a lot of Mountain Dew cans, it looks like.
Looks like some Mountain Dew cans and maybe some beef jerky, something like that?
That may be right. I think it is beef jerky, I'm not sure.
And may the record reflect, I did increase magnification on the TV. Just to,
It can. I just am resisting saying something, Mr. Bogan. I'm smiling at you.
so, and that's another area that you didn't collect any evidence from, correct?
That is correct.
I'd now like to turn your attention to some of the exhibits that were introduced by the prosecution yesterday, and I'm going to ask them kindly to publish them. Starting with, do you need the cord, or do you guys got?
Well, of course it did. So just so the jury knows, they tried this morning and it worked. So.
No, I'm getting it. And I'd respectfully request two things. One, the people to publish prosecution 72, and I'd ask to move about the courtroom while we're talking about the issues here, Judge.
That's fine. Just hang on to the microphone if you're away from it.
By all means. Turning your attention to the screen behind you, sir, does that look like how the living room looked when you first entered and exited during your investigation on November 29, 2012?
That is an image of what it looked like when I entered. We had altered the surroundings a little bit with the luminol and also replaced furniture in a slightly different position, I believe.
Okay. And safe to say what we see in this photo is we got what appears to be some sort of football right here, correct?
Yes.
And there appears to be some sort of flyer on the coffee table.
I'm not sure what that is, but yeah, there's obviously items on top of the coffee table.
And this is the front door right here, correct?
Correct, and it is open, as you can see.
Right. And this is before luminol was applied to this part of the house, correct?
Yes, you can see the bedding is still on the couch, and items are on top of the love seat.
And safe to say, we also got what appears to be a space heater, table, another table and a lamp, another lamp in the corner, correct?
All items that would be appropriate for a living room, yes.
Respectfully request that people to publish prosecution 71. Same room, slightly different angle, correct?
That is correct. You can see the love seat and the couch clearly, the table, the carpet, a pair of shoes, and access into the first floor bathroom, I believe.
And I think you pointed it out, and we got the television and the television stand on the viewer's left, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. I respectfully request publication of prosecution 170. 170. In this prosecution exhibit, we can see that it appears that luminol's been applied to the furniture, correct?
That is correct. I had applied the luminol. It's water-based. The water has evaporated and left a residue.
And that residue, is that sort of the white film we see on the couch and the love seat?
And on the floor, yes, you can clearly see it. I can clearly see it.
Please publish prosecution 159. And 159 is kind of is it your test or your control paper towel?
It is a paper towel. This is just like a bounty piece of paper that I apply a known blood source, and again, I poke my own finger and dilute that so I know the luminol works with blood. It has some bleach on it that is not visible in regular light. It is dried, and that gives me the false positive that sparkles, and then part of the tissue does not have anything on it, so that works as a negative. It should not glow. If it glows, there's a problem with my luminol. The bleach should give me that sparkling reaction, and the blood should give me that nice glow where it fades back to nothing.
And the reason you do this is to make sure the luminol is in fact working when you mix it up, correct?
That is correct. You would do that with basically any reagents you're working with. Make sure that a negative does not work and that a positive does work in the appropriate ways.
Respectfully request publication of 158. And safe to say 158 is the same paper towel with luminol on it, lights out, correct?
That is correct. Luminol works best when it's absolutely dark. You can't see the paper towel, but I was there, I held it. So I know that this is my reagent. Part of it is black because the reagent does not work on paper towel. It does work on bleach and it does work on my blood, and that's what you're seeing there.
So there's bleach and human blood in this picture, correct?
That is correct, and nothing.
And nothing. Which is which, as far as the bleach and the blood?
The bleach will be the sparkly, round-looking stain. Obviously, this is just a still photograph. You don't see the sparkle. We had tried years ago to videotape this so you could see the actual glow. It doesn't work well. The videotape just didn't work well. Still photography seemed to work better. So this is just a normal digital picture of my control.
Normal digital picture taken by the FBI in an investigation of a missing child, correct?
Correct.
And the bleach is the circle, your blood is the triangle, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Ask the prosecution, or I'm sorry, respectfully request the prosecution to publish prosecution 160. And do you recall this being the corner of the coffee table where you applied luminol?
That is correct. You can see the blue glow on the edge.
And I'll ask you to look up here. We also see kind of a clear substance on the coffee table as well, correct?
I believe that's not a clear substance, but rather a light reflection from the window nearby. It's just a glare.
You don't believe that that's more luminol that was sprayed onto there?
It may be, but it's just catching the light. It's,
Okay.
it may be water-based, that's the edges are catching some light from the window.
Right. That shiny stuff we're seeing on the corner of the table reflecting light, right?
Correct.
And we can see where it's kind of beating up, right?
That is correct.
And it strikes you as a water-based material, right?
That is correct.
Probably luminol. Sprayed this area with luminol.
Obviously, you see some blue glow there, so luminol has been applied. I don't spray the luminol just on that one little area, so it's probably just the luminol that's not reacting with anything that's catching the light, the water-based luminol.
Right. So this is all parts of the coffee table where luminol is not reacting.
That is correct.
And as you look at Peoples 160, do you see any white marks or sponge marks?
Not that I would identify, no.
.162, please. What do you recognize this as?
Again, this is one of the pieces of the furniture in the living room. You can see my broken sticks of the Q-tips, if you will, on there. And you can see 2 or 3 small areas of luminescence where the luminol is actually reacting with substance on the leather.
And you described yesterday that when you get a reaction like this, that strikes you as an area of interest that should require more investigation, right?
More testing, yes.
Right, more testing. And part of your process is once you've identified an area like that is to use a swab in that area, correct?
That is correct, to collect the stain.
Right, and describe for the jury what that swab looks like. Is it a glorified Q-tip? What are we talking about here?
If you've had your throat swabbed by a doctor's office, I think they're 6-inch long. These are sterile. They come, I believe, I was using a 2-pack. The swabs, you have to peel the paper apart to access the swabs, and they have a little bit of cotton on the end for the collection of whatever you're collecting.
And because you're trying to gather as much biological evidence as possible, you swab that whole area in the hopes to get as much biological material as possible.
That's correct. Yesterday, if you recall, there was a picture that had some luminol that looked like it was running. Gravity works. And so I'm going to swab the area, not just where the luminescence is occurring, but the entire area. So if there is some, I collect that also, that may be running with the liquid.
And that's because you want to provide the lab at CBI with the most biological material you can in those circumstances.
That is correct. I want to get as much as I can on there. This is a minute amount to begin with. I want to maximize my collection.
Respectfully request publication of 166. Do you recognize that as an area in the living room where luminol was applied?
That is on the floor of the living room. The carpet has been removed, and I believe that's a leg of the tripod of the camera at the bottom of the photograph.
And you don't see any wipe marks, mop marks, or sponge marks there, correct?
Not that I would identify, no.
168, please. And do you recognize this as another area in the living room where luminol was applied?
Yes.
And do you see any wipe marks, sponge marks, towel marks?
Not that I would identify, no.
We can take that down, thanks. I want to follow up a little bit on luminol and phenolphthalein. You with me?
Yes.
Just direct your attention to that issue. And as you said, it is a presumptive test, correct?
That is correct, both of them.
Both phenolphthalein and luminol are presumptive.
That is correct.
And that's why when you take these swabs of these areas where you try and gather as much biological material as possible, you send them to the lab at CBI, correct?
That is one possibility. In this case, I gave them to the local agency or the FBI. But the idea is to swab that area, collect as much as I can, so when the lab gets it, it has a sufficient sample to test.
And you know from your experience in these sorts of investigations and evidence gathering that these swabs are then tested at another lab, CBI in this case, to see if there is in fact blood on those, correct?
They will do further testing on those and confirm the presence or refute what my test showed. Their tests are way more sensitive than I do in the field.
And even though, well, one thing luminol doesn't tell you, it doesn't tell you how long this presumptive blood has been in an area, correct?
No, it cannot. There have been numerous tests and research on this. You can't age a stain of blood. It's just not possible.
And the same thing can be said of phenolphthalein, that it cannot tell you when that material was deposited there, correct?
That is correct. They're both presumptive and they do not age a stain.
And the same can be said of the ABA card that you use as well. That cannot give you a date and time or even range of when that stain was put there, correct?
Again, there's no way to date a stain. If it's wet blood, you have an idea. Once it dries, if it's protected from sunlight, if it's protected from elements like, say, a dog walking through it, there's just no way to date that stain.
And one of the reasons that you know that luminol and, well, luminol in particular is presumptive is because, as you testified yesterday, luminol can provide false positive tests for blood, correct?
It does. That is correct. It does not just react with human blood. There's a number of substances, the cupric salts we talked about, the bleach, that it may react with. Visually recognizable, but again, you're getting a false positive reading from a chemical.
And like you said, that's cupric salts, bleach, copper salts as well, correct?
That's correct.
And that's because the luminol reacts with iron, correct?
It does. The heme group in hemoglobin is what it's looking for chemically. So any of these metal salts may give you a false positive, but it is reactive with iron, and that's found in hemoglobin in blood.
And luminol, as you've testified several times, is a water-based substance, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, I think that's how you mix it up, right? You're mixing water and some other stuff, right?
Correct.
And therefore, it can dilute the stains that it comes in contact with, because that's what water does.
It will dilute the stain.
And can you tell the jury how sensitive the luminol is that you mixed up in that living room that day?
I am no longer familiar with the exact sensitivity of luminol, but I believe it's like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100,000. So if you have 1 drop of blood in like a gallon of water, it should react to that. And that's my best recollection of that. There have been numerous studies on how sensitive these chemicals are. I simply just don't recall the exact numbers anymore.
But to the best of your recollection, it's 1 to 100,000.
I believe that is correct, yes.
1 drop of blood, but with 999,000 drops of water is going to make that gallon test positive for presumptively blood.
I believe it is 1 to 100,000, correct.
Now, as part of your investigation of this house, you applied luminol in every room, correct?
I'm not sure if I applied blood in the guest bedroom. I know I did in the master bedroom and in the living room, and I believe in the upstairs bathroom or laundry room.
Your testimony today is you don't recall applying luminol in every room of the house?
Because I don't report out negatives, if there's nothing of evidentiary value found in the room, I may not report that out. I just don't recall. I know where I did find stains of interest. I do not recall if I applied luminol in every room of that house.
And you've testified about this case before, in fact, back on July 19th, 2017, correct?
That may be the right date. I have testified before.
About this matter, about these topics, about this case, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Would looking at a transcript of your sworn testimony from that date help you recall if you applied luminol in every room of this house?
It would help, yes.
Permission to approach.
Yes.
Discovery 458.
There's a different page number for that.
I have reviewed this.
And safe to say, at that occasion, on July 19th, 2017, you testified that you didn't apply luminol to every surface in the house, but you did apply luminol in every room.
I applied luminol where I thought it was appropriate. I may not apply it under a bed, for instance. I may not apply it on ceilings because that would be a visual test if you have cast off. So I did apply it in various rooms. I did not apply it, again, under the dresser, under a bed. Those kind of areas are not appropriate to look at.
And you just testified you applied it in various rooms, but your sworn testimony from the certified transcript, last time you testified about this, was that you applied it in every room, correct?
Okay, yes.
And you know that because you read the transcript right there of your testimony.
Also correct.
Permission to collect that document?
Yes.
Moving on to phenothalene, you spoke about that yesterday as well, correct?
I did.
And you described phenolphthalein as an indicator, not an identifier, yes or no?
That is correct, yes.
Meaning it can indicate, presumptively, there may be blood there, correct?
Also correct, yes.
It does not identify the substance conclusively as blood.
It indicates the presence of blood.
But it does not identify it, and it is presumptive, correct?
Correct.
And as you know, it's the lab at CBI who can make that ultimate determination better than you in the field, correct?
They identify the source, correct.
And they also test it to see if it's actually blood, correct?
They duplicate my test to make sure I collected the appropriate sample. That is correct.
And one of the things you testified about yesterday was you said that in your opinion that, one, you thought there was some sort of bloodletting event in the living room, correct?
I believe that's obvious to me, yes.
And based upon that and where you had presumptive positive tests in the living room over a certain area, you thought that indicated movement of some kind, correct?
That is also correct.
And those opinions presuppose that there was only one event in that living room, correct?
I can't say that.
You can't say that.
No.
So you can't say whether or not, you can't say how many bleeding events were in that living room, correct?
I can testify to where my tests found blood or indicated the presence of blood. I collected the appropriate samples. I was not there when this bloodletting event occurred or events. I simply can testify to what I found.
Right, but you can't testify to how many events occurred, if any, in that living room.
I can testify that there was at least one.
At least one, but you can't testify if there was 2, 3, 4, the same way you can't testify as to when those stains appeared.
I believe I've addressed that, yes. I cannot say there were 2, 3, or 4 events. I cannot testify to when the blood was deposited there. I can simply testify to the fact that I ran known scientific tests and indicated the presence of blood that I collected.
And that's where it begins and ends, correct?
For me, yes.
Right. And that's why there's further investigation after you go to the scene, correct?
There is further examination of those stains. That is correct.
And not only can you not identify how many events were in that room or when those stains were deposited there, you cannot identify how much material we're talking about here, correct?
That is correct. I was not there for an event. I was simply there to collect the stains that I found.
Right. So you can't look at a particular exhibit from the people and say, this luminol reaction is consistent with this much or this little material being here.
No, I can simply say my luminol, which was run against a control and a negative, reacted positive in these areas.
Nothing further, Judge.
You direct. Thank you, Your Honor. Let me start, Mr. Clayton, with where counsel left off. So counsel was asking you that you can't say how much blood is there, correct?
That is correct.
And you're talking about quantity, right? Like volume.
Yes,
But you can say how much area was covered by the indications from the luminol.
that is correct.
And then the blood that you're looking at, it's taking 1 drop in 100,000 drops of water, right?
I believe that is correct. That makes me nervous.
Sure, sure. So let's say for argument's sake that it's, at this point, you need a substance that's very strong to find it because there's no visible stain there anymore.
That is correct.
So in counsel's line of questions, we wouldn't know how much blood had been there before the blood was cleaned up, correct?
That is correct.
Objection form of the question assumes facts not in evidence, AKA cleanup.
I understood your objection, Mr. Pope. Please phrase those if that had happened.
Sure, if there had been a cleanup.
That is correct.
So let me just talk to you about something very basic. Does blood have a color?
It does.
What color is blood?
Typically, you think of blood as the red blood cell, and it has a reddish-brown hue. Most people are familiar with what blood looks like.
So if I bleed right here on this table, you're going to see it.
In sufficient quantity, I would, yes.
And that blood, if I have it here, it's going to stay there and it's going to turn kind of brown, right?
It will, yes.
And that's what you're walking around the house looking for?
Visually, I am examining for that color.
But if I take a rag, it's wet, and I wipe that away, you'll no longer see it.
Correct.
But if you apply luminol, which can find 1 in 100,000, and we're talking 1 drop to 100,000 drops, you can maybe find that same stain there.
Again, I'm not 100% confident on my numbers, but I believe 1 to 100,000 is correct, and I would find it with luminol.
Is it fair to say that in a crime scene investigation, that's kind of the point of luminol?
Very much so.
If it had been cleaned up or wiped away, you're still looking for it.
That is correct.
In this scene that you came upon, you talked about it not being a fresh scene. Based on the briefing, how long had it been since the child was missing?
I believe it was 10 days, maybe.
Thank you. So let me ask you about bleach. Does bleach have an odor?
It does.
And if you were to clean a room with bleach, you'd smell it, right?
For some time, you could air it out, but yeah, you'll smell bleach.
Right.
Most people know that smell.
So let's say for argument's sake, if someone needed to clean up that room and the areas that go out, if they used bleach but someone was coming in there, that odor might still be there when someone came in there later in the day.
That's correct. It was leather, and leather will absorb bleach.
Okay. Are there other ways to clean up blood besides bleach?
Yes,
Let's use the table example again. If I bled on the table and there's a brown stain, is it pretty easy in your experience to remove that brown stain simply with water and a rag?
correct.
Thank you. I want to turn your attention to something that was discussed yesterday. It was about documentation. Do you remember that line of question from defense?
I do.
Okay. And you were asked about this case and what was documented and what wasn't, right?
Correct.
Was this a joint investigation?
Yes, there were numerous agencies, at least 3 agencies were involved in this.
And does that include FBI, CBI, La Plata County, and even some search and rescue people were helping out?
That's correct, yes.
How many is it fair to say there were multiple officers and agents involved in the actual search warrant itself?
That's correct. Everybody was looking for anything of evidentiary value.
Now, when you do your job, you're doing your job specific to biological samples.
In this case, yes.
And when we use the term document for you, you said you don't document negatives, you document what you found.
That's correct.
Can we assume negatives at all other locations besides where you report to?
Leading.
Do not believe that's a leading question, Your Honor.
I'm going to allow it to go forward.
Can we assume negatives at the locations that you didn't report back blood?
That is correct.
But in terms of documentation itself, were photographs taken in this case?
Yes.
Is it fair to say nearly 200 photographs were taken in this case?
I'm not familiar with the number, but there were numerous photographs.
Basically every portion of the house.
Yes, and outside.
Did you take those photographs or did someone else?
The FBI was in charge of photography in this case.
Did those document the entirety of what was observed on scene in this case?
I believe they do, yes.
And that documentation, a lot of that's what was provided to the defense counsel that they put in as exhibits so the jury could see those areas, right?
Objection foundation. I don't think he can speak to what's been discovered to us. Relevance as well.
You know, I think the jury can assume that. I understand the objection. It's correct. So I'm going to sustain it.
Okay, let me ask you a different question. Those 200 or so photographs, close to 200 photographs, are those so prosecutors, defense attorneys, and jurors can all see the documentation of the areas you looked at?
Same objection, Judge.
No, that's different. It's allowed.
Yes, they are.
So it's fair to say the scene's actually thoroughly documented?
I believe it was, yes. There were a number of eyes on this number of people looking at the same areas over and over.
And then in addition to the photographic documentation, is there also an FBI casebook?
Yes, there is.
And did you review that casebook?
Yes, I did.
It's about 60 pages long.
It is long, yes.
Does it document the steps that were taken in the house?
Yes.
Does it document notes about what all of the people inside the house did?
Yes, it does, thoroughly.
Does it document the items that were seized?
Yes, it does.
Does it document scene security?
Yes, it does.
Does it even document...
Relevance, Judge.
Pardon me?
Relevance as to what gets documented.
Well, this is in response to what you brought out, so I think it's appropriate. Go ahead.
Thank you. Does it even document the times that these things occur?
Yes.
Does it even document measurements in case someday somebody wants to be able to measure out the dimensions of the room?
Yes, a sketch was done, a rough sketch. It is not to scale in the diagram, but it does document the exact dimensions of things.
To the inch.
To the inch.
Now, you're assigned evidence collection itself, that biological evidence. Are you responsible for collecting physical items?
Not at this scene, no.
So things like weapons, you'll observe if they have biological matter on them, but you're not responsible for collecting that type of item.
No, I was not at this scene.
What about things like a child's belongings, like a backpack or cell phone? Is that something you're looking for?
No, I may note it and I may point it out to the investigators, but my job was for the biological aspect of the case.
Fishing poles, things like that, are you assigned to look for that?
No.
Is there someone else who's assigned to do that role of the investigation?
Yes.
My final question on this is when we're talking about your documentation, you noted you document anything that you do find, but do you list every surface area in the report that didn't have blood on it?
No, I would not.
Does that make any sense to do?
No.
Now, I want to talk to you, I think there was some mention about the washing machine in that room. We talked about the swabs yesterday, and we addressed specifically swabs 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 on your diagram, right?
Correct.
Was it, just to be thorough, was there also a swab 4?
Yes.
Where was that from?
I believe it was from the piping to the washing area, the washing machine laundry area.
And that was something that was presumptive blood, so you took a swab?
Objection leading. What did the swab tell you?
Okay. What did the swab tell you?
It was not blood.
Okay. Did you collect it, though, and send it off to Colorado Bureau of Investigation?
I collected it because I don't determine that in the lab or on the scene. I did collect it. It turned out to be a negative.
All right. So bottom line is, what I'm getting at is, you collect swab 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 from the living room. There's also a swab 4. Now we know where that came from as well. Do all of those swabs then go for later testing that we can hear about through those agents?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, counsel talked to you about the processing and whether you did every room or not, and whether you did every surface or not. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
In the transcript, you reviewed it, correct?
That is correct.
Are you pretty clear in that transcript, as you were today, that where you apply luminol is sort of a tactical decision as you go room by room?
That is correct, yes.
So what are some surface areas? You talked about ceilings and floors, but are there other surface areas that are just not real well processed by luminol because of substances that might be on them?
Yes.
Can you just explain that to the jury, please?
Again, laundry rooms where you would have bleach or cleansers, bathrooms may give you false positives because people clean tubs or showers with chemicals like Comet or Ajax cleansers. I think you need to be very diligent in where you apply this. It is not just a random choice. Vertical surfaces are hard. You saw a picture of the blood, the presumptive blood actually flowing down from where it was. So if you spray it on the side of something smooth like a stove or refrigerator, gravity's gonna work. It's gonna flow down. So you have to decide where you want to apply it, where your highest potential of finding something is, and that would be on a surface not covered up, like underneath a bed, underneath a dresser. Carpets, floors are good catchers because as you mist, the mist comes down, settles, and you get a positive reaction.
So as you go room by room, are there some places that it just makes sense to look for stains?
I think it is, yes.
And are there other places that lend themselves to luminol processing to try to find potential blood that's no longer visible to the naked eye?
I believe so, yes.
And is that the process you used as you went room by room by room to this house?
Yes.
Now, the living room itself, that is is that one of the rooms that you completely processed with luminol?
Yes.
Does it lend itself to that in the description you just gave?
I believe so. The only concern I have is on vertical surfaces like the bottom of the couch, because you have to not spray luminol in such intensity that you wash that stain away. Gravity's going to work. That luminol is going to run down any kind of surface like that. You can see on the cushion where the stain stayed there, but on the vertical surfaces, it tends to run if you apply it too forcefully.
So, do you recall from the briefing what room in the house the child was last seen, Dylan was last seen?
I believe it was the living room. We had very limited information as I went into the house, which I prefer.
And do you recall if there was a room where there was some reported roughhousing in?
Again, I believe it.
Objection. Scope. Hearsay.
No, this does go beyond the scope.
Understood, Your Honor. So, to get back within the scope, I want to direct you a little more. So, counsel was asking which rooms you applied luminol in, what areas, and what areas you found things. The living room, was there a point in time in the living room where you had seen something that, a spot on the coffee table that you swabbed without the luminol?
That is correct. I noticed it.
Why did you notice it and swab it?
A great amount of my time is just spent looking at things. And so as you examine something like an initial walkthrough, I'm not looking for a baseball bat or something like that. I'm just looking for what the surfaces look like. When I start actually examining, then I go from, if we use the table that the attorney had talked about, I go from corner to corner, inside, outside, upside down. I look at it very thoroughly. And that's when I noticed on that northeast corner, there was a small reddish-brown stain. That stain could be taco sauce. I trust my eyes, but then I trust my chemicals. I swabbed it, I tested it, I sprayed luminol on it. I believe it's highly indicative of blood.
And you swabbed it before you applied the luminol and processed that row?
I did.
And so when you find something like that, does that then lend itself to process in the room?
Of course, I've got a drop of blood. There may be stuff there that I just can't see.
I'd like to segue to another topic that counsel addressed. There was some talk about wipe marks, and counsel asked you if you saw anything that you could testify to as a wipe mark. Do you remember that line of questioning?
I do.
Are there also areas, let me ask you in the converse. So counsel asked you if you can testify that there were wipe marks. Based on the photographs that we have here, the snapshot in time of the luminol, can you testify that there weren't wipe marks?
No, I could not testify that they were not. The area involved is a relatively large area on these pieces of furniture. Being found with luminol suggests some movement and some activity in that area. I don't think there's a big enough pattern to really draw a qualified blood pattern interpretation of the area. It's been altered. I just don't know how.
Okay. And you've testified before in pattern analysis as an expert witness.
I have.
Would it be responsible here to take a handful of these photographs and try to tell the jury a pattern analysis? I
would not do that, no.
And you were on scene. You saw this illuminate and deluminate. Is it responsible to try to tell them a pattern analysis?
No, I think firsthand information is better. I was there. I saw the reaction. I know how luminol reacts after using it many, many times. And there's a clear difference in being there and looking at one picture of what the pattern looks like.
Let me show you a couple of exhibits just to finish this thought. I'm going to show you 162. In looking at this photograph, can you say either way whether there's a white mark?
There's simply not enough data here. I've got 2 or 3 small areas visible around that seam. There's an old saying, a stain does not make a pattern. And so these little indications of blood with luminol, there's just not enough data there to draw a reasonable conclusion about how much was there or how it got there, how old it is. You simply can't do that.
And 163, even if we brighten or enhance that photograph, a layperson might look at that and think that they can interpret it, right? But would it be responsible of you as an expert witness to do any kind of pattern analysis?
Objection. Form of the question.
Overruled.
I do not believe even this allows you to draw very much of a conclusion. You can see on the seam, the marks on the seam, that there appears to be some directionality, a smear or wipe. There's just not enough there for me to be comfortable to say this is from this action. I just don't think there's enough there. This is also the photo I was talking about where below the seam, you can see where the stain is running with the water-based luminol. And that's what you have to watch out for on vertical surfaces. You're going to move the stain. There's just not enough data here for me to draw a reasonable conclusion.
Now, can you rule it out?
No.
And then as you look at it, can you say that at least at one point in time that there was blood based on all the testing you did?
Oh, absolutely.
But it was no longer visible to the naked eye.
That is correct. I could not see this. I would not have applied luminol.
I'm going to show 166. Now, can you definitively, one way or another, say that there are white marks here?
No.
And then with regard to this picture itself, you can see how there's a little bit of shape to some of the luminol illumination.
That's correct.
Let me ask you a general question. So if, setting this aside, but speaking generally, if someone bleeds on a surface area and that blood dries, and then it's wiped away, no longer visible to the naked eye, does it sometimes retain a little bit of that shape from the time when it dried?
It may, yes.
Thank you, sir. Take this down. So all the work in this case, if I'm accurate, was done back in 2012, correct?
That is correct.
And then you were comfortably retired since 2015?
That is also correct.
Is it helpful to have some of the diagrams, photographs, casebook, things like that to work through in this process?
Yes, I've done so many of these, it's hard to remember exactly which way I'm facing or what I'm looking at. The photographs definitely help.
Now, that said, do you distinctly remember the processing of this house?
I do.
Was this a massive search warrant, one that was notable to you?
Yes,
Now, in particular, the living room, do you specifically recall the living room?
I do.
And are there things about the processing of this living room that stood out to you in your memory, even today?
Form of the question, asked and answered, cumulative. We're
Okay.
doing direct again.
Actually, I'll ask a different question, Your Honor.
All right.
So, Mr. Clayton, defense talked to you about all the rooms in the house and whether there was evidence of a bloody or violent struggle. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes, I do.
And you talked about the bedroom, and you told the jury, no, there's no evidence of that, right?
Correct.
You talked about the bathrooms. You told this jury, no, there's no evidence about that, right?
Also correct.
What about the living room?
Asked and answered and testified about ad nauseum.
Counsel raised this.
Overruled. Go ahead.
What about the living room?
There was obviously at least a bloodletting event in this room. I do not know the DNA results. I don't know how many possible bleeders there were. I did a thorough search of that room, indicated the presence of blood in several areas, notably under the carpet, and collected those stains and forwarded those to the appropriate authorities for further testing.
And do you factor in the circumstances of the room, the entirety, as you process it?
Yes, I do.
Do you factor in the fact that 10 days after the child's missing, there's still bedding placed on the couch?
Scope.
I don't think that's the scope. You were talking about evidence that was observed and whether or not there was evidence of a struggle. I think it's appropriate. Go ahead.
Do you factor in things like bedding laid out on the couch?
I do.
Do you factor in things like a football and missing child things placed around the room?
That is correct.
Do you factor in whether blood's found on a floor or under a rug?
That's very interesting to me, yes.
And do you factor in whether there's blood stain on the rug itself, or the rug's simply covering the blood stain?
Again, I factor a lot of those items in. That is unusual in my eyes.
And do you factor in whether the blood's at a singular location or in different areas of the room?
Yes, I do.
Based on everything you observed in that living room, and based on your expert opinion, is it different than all those other rooms in that it looks like there could have been consistent with a bloodletting event that could be a violent struggle?
Yes.
Mr. Clayton, I want to thank you for coming back more than 8 years later and testifying to the work that you do. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Questions from the jury? All right. From the jury, how long does it take for the sun to damage a blood sample or a blood stain?
The sun,
Yes.
if you have a stain that's deposited like on hot asphalt out in the middle of a sunny day, it's going to take very little time, a matter of minutes, before that will be denatured. If you have a stain that's inside and you have a filtered light, that stain is viable. I can test that stain for maybe years. If you paint over a stain and that stain is in the sunlight, that stain may be not damaged by the sunlight, again, for years, if you can visibly see it. It just depends. Colorado is very dry, and we have a high UV index a lot of times. So if the stain is exposed to direct sunlight, it's going to be damaged quite quickly.
Okay. And this is in a similar vein, and both these questions are pretty much the same. And the questions are both asking, how long does it take before blood can no longer be testable by luminol?
Again, I think it depends. I've tested stains with luminol for that were deposited years before and still had a reaction. If they are subject to intense sunlight, any type of cleaning activity, especially with detergent or surfactant, like in Dawn detergent or bleach, you can denature that stain quite quickly. Hydrogen peroxide will just simply digest the stain to where you can't see it. Luminol, if the stain is relatively protected in any way, is you can test that blood for years after the fact.
Okay. Anything else from counsel?
Just briefly, Your Honor. So, Mr. Clayton, with regard to stains in sunlight, just generally speaking, if there's a stain on an indoor surface that's reddish-brown, is the sunlight going to make that stain go away?
No.
Okay. But what we're talking about is it can degrade a blood sample like in an outdoor setting.
Correct.
I don't have anything further. Thank you, Judge.
Anything, Mr. Buccal?
So luminol will react with presumptive blood up to years after it's been deposited in a certain area.
That is correct.
Nothing further.
Okay. Can this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
He's not under service from us, so yes.
You're free to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your next witness?
Your Honor, the people call Rebecca Strut, then.
Come on up to the witness stand, please. And raise your right hand before you sit down. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you please state your name, spelling your last name for the record?
Rebecca Strub, S-T-R-U-B.
Are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed with the Colorado Springs Metro Crime Lab in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
And what's your position with the lab?
I am the DNA technical leader, and I do DNA and serology casework there as well as the technical supervisor.
So both as someone who works on the DNA and as a supervisor, what does your job involve on a daily basis?
I do serology casework as well as DNA casework as well as supervisory duties.
How long have you been doing this type of work?
I've been employed with the Colorado Springs Metro Crime Lab since June of 2014. Prior to that, I was employed with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation Forensic Regional Laboratory in Pueblo, Colorado.
I'd like you to take the jury through your education and experience. Would you do that now?
In 1994, I received my Bachelor of Arts degree from St. Mary's College in Winona, Minnesota in biology and chemistry. In 1997, I received my Master of Science degree in pharmacology, toxicology, and biochemistry from the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks.
And can you walk us through your career experience in the field, please?
I started with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in July of 2000 as evidence custodian. I was promoted to a CRIM 1 or an analyst position in the laboratory in 2002. I went through approximately a 6-month training program prior to starting serology casework in 2003 with the CBI laboratory, and I went through approximately a year-long training program in DNA analysis prior to starting DNA casework at the CBI lab in 2005.
You mentioned serology casework. What is that?
Forensic serology is the examination of physical evidence for the presence of various body fluids. In addition to testing items of evidence for body fluids, we also prepare samples for DNA testing.
What kind of education or training do you do to stay current in your position, specifically with regards to forensic serology and DNA analysis?
I keep up on current journals and articles that are coming out in the field, as well as I'm required to do at least 8 hours of continuing education a year.
And do you engage in both forensic serology and DNA analysis in your current position?
Yes, I do.
And is that the same kind of work you did when you were at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation?
Yes, it is.
Have you previously testified in court as an expert witness?
Yes, I have.
Have you testified as an expert in forensic serology?
Yes, I have.
Testified as an expert in DNA analysis?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times have you been qualified as an expert witness?
In excess of 75 times.
Is that here in the state of Colorado?
Yes.
And just for the record, can you just name some of the counties in which a court has qualified you as an expert witness in these fields?
El Paso County, Pueblo County, La Plata County. I think those are the main ones that I've testified in.
Your Honor, at this time, we'd move to qualify Ms. Strub as an expert in forensic serology and DNA analysis.
No objection.
Should be qualified in those fields.
Ma'am, are you familiar with the investigation involving a defendant by the name of Mark Redwine?
Yes, I am.
Can you tell the jury, please, how you became involved in this case?
I became involved in this case when I was employed with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation after evidence was submitted for serology and DNA testing in this case.
Fair to say a number of people, several people from CBI have worked on this case over the years?
That is correct.
And there have been many, many pieces of evidence submitted to CBI in connection with this investigation.
I believe so.
How does CBI receive evidence in regards to an investigation generally?
Requests are submitted to the laboratory, and when the evidence is submitted, generally there is a cover letter or a discussion with analysts involved in the case or that have potential to be involved in the case based on what type of analysis they are requesting at the laboratory. The evidence is then submitted to our evidence custodian and is stored in our evidence vault until analysis is begun by a particular analyst that's assigned to the case.
Was that procedure followed in this particular case?
Yes, it was.
So just taking a step back for a minute, when you talked about a discussion regarding the request, what is that about?
We try and sit down with either detectives or crime scene personnel to get a background of the case so we have an idea of what questions we are trying to answer in a case and what evidence is going to be most probative for us to work.
So, for example, if a husband is accused of killing his wife in the bedroom, strangles her to death, and the law enforcement investigator shows up and says, I'm going to submit every single piece of furniture and every piece of fabric from the entire house, what does CBI do?
We will try and narrow down which items are going to be the most probative, which is going to answer the investigative questions in first round of testing. We may do multiple rounds of testing depending on whether or not the investigative questions have been answered in the first round or not.
When an item of evidence does come to CBI, what's the process within CBI, the evidence being received and the analysis being conducted?
When a case is received into the laboratory, again, the evidence is placed in the evidence vault. The case is assigned to an individual depending on what type of analyses are being requested. That individual, when they are ready to work the case, they will request the items of evidence that they are going to process from the evidence custodian, and they will take it into, if it's for the biology unit for serology and DNA analysis, we have exam rooms that we would process and screen these items of evidence. Those items of evidence would be taken into the custody of the assigned analyst and processed accordingly.
How does CBI or you note on a physical piece of evidence that it's been handled by you or it's within your control?
Every item of evidence is physically documented in our case notes, but the item of evidence is also marked with the CBI case number that is unique to that case, the analyst initials, and item number.
Is that process and protocol followed in this case?
Yes, it was.
Do you have a certain order in which you conduct your forensic analysis on multiple pieces of evidence?
One item of evidence is opened at a time. Depending on what I am looking for on a particular item of evidence, I will determine the lower items. If I'm looking for DNA that is going to have smaller amounts of DNA, I will process those items first. And again, each item is opened one at a time, and in between each item, we go through a rigorous cleaning process of 10% bleach solution, as well as water rinse and reagent alcohol rinse, and gloves are changed in between every item of evidence, and many times changed numerous times while we are examining one piece of evidence to avoid any cross-contamination. And the item after processing is sealed up before, and that procedure is gone through cleaning procedures before the next item of evidence is opened.
What is the result of that cleaning process you undertake in the lab?
We are trying to avoid any contamination from item to item in the laboratory.
And is it fair to say you also remove any substances that are left behind through that cleaning process?
Yes.
Before you begin an examination or analysis, do you get a sense of the evidence that you've received?
Can you elaborate on that question?
Sure. What do you do when you first receive multiple items of evidence, you yourself?
I examine the cover letter and determine what needs to be done on a particular item of evidence, and I go through my training. I determine how I'm going to proceed processing a particular item of evidence. If it's an item of an article of clothing, I will do a visual examination. Then I may use an alternate light source depending on what I'm looking for. I will mark any stained areas that I want to test with a chemical test before I proceed with any chemical testing.
And do you also receive information from the analysis conducted by crime scene investigators?
We have access to the crime scene reports as well.
I'm going to shift gears here for you, okay? What are known samples?
Known reference samples are what we call buccal swabs that come from a known individual, and we use those, what we call reference or known samples, to create a DNA profile from those individuals, and those are individuals that may be involved in an investigation. We need known reference samples so that we can compare them to the question profiles that may be developed in a case in order to determine whether or not they may be a contributor or match a DNA profile that is produced from a question sample.
So if something happened here in the courthouse over the weekend and there was a need to get my buccal swab as a witness, not a suspect, how would you do that? Can you explain that to the jury?
Buccal swabs are collected. Generally, it's at least two swabs that are held together, and they're rubbed on the inside of your cheek so that we can get cellular material called buccal swabs from the inside of the mouth. Those are submitted as a buccal swab standard from an individual.
And that's the same for a witness or suspect?
That's the same for any individual that's involved in the case.
How do buccal swabs come to you at CBI?
They are submitted in the same fashion that any question samples are submitted in a case. They are related to that particular case. They are submitted under the case number that CBI has pulled in the particular case, so it's unique to that case, and it's given a unique item number and is processed in the same fashion that the question samples are processed. Buccal swabs are always prepared at the very end after all the question samples are looked at.
Why is that?
So that, again, we don't have any cross-contamination with reference samples in the question samples. So all the question samples that are submitted and requested in one particular request are processed prior to the reference samples being even processed to go forward for DNA analysis.
When you have an investigation in which you're going to conduct forensic serology and forensic DNA analysis, which one do you do first?
The serology testing is completed first because we are screening the items for any body fluids and preparing them for DNA testing.
What if you don't find a serological stain, any indication of blood? What do you do with that item then?
It depends on what the item is and what the circumstances involved in that particular item, whether or not we proceed forward doing DNA analysis on that particular item.
So you start with serological testing.
That's correct.
Let me ask you a few questions just to get the jury oriented to what you're doing in the lab when it comes to testing for blood, okay? Let's say someone cuts me and I bleed on the table and the blood's just sitting. What is done at the crime scene to take the blood and allow you to test it in the lab?
Visible blood stain would be collected at the crime scene, generally with cotton tip swabs. They may use other methods to collect visible blood stains as well, depending on the surface that they're collecting it from. And those are submitted to the lab for us to do testing on the swab.
And if the blood were left behind after I were cut and it bled here, would luminol or phenolphthalein be used on the surface?
It may be used at the scene, yes.
And is the purpose of luminol and phenolphthalein to look for blood that may not be visible to the naked eye?
Generally, luminol is used when you are looking for non-visible blood at a scene.
So, for example, if a husband kills his wife and there's a pool of blood or some blood left behind and he cleans it up, would that be the kind of circumstance where you'd expect luminol to be used?
Yes.
And under that same scenario, husband kills wife, and then cleans it up. What's the impact of the cleaning on what's left behind?
When you're using luminol on an area that may have been cleaned up or an area that there is no longer visible blood being detected, you're spraying a chemical on that area. You're diluting out something that's already not visible to the naked eye. So you're diluting out your stains that may have been there to try and detect the presence of luminol. Then you would collect a sample from that area if it's positive for luminol in order to do our chemical test or the phenolphthalein test to detect whether or not blood is present.
Just to break that down, when the husband cleans up the blood, what's the impact of the cleaning process on the evidentiary value there?
Again, the cleaning process is going to remove the visible blood, so you're diluting the stains that were there. In addition to whatever cleaning products are there, could also be affecting the luminol test.
And then when luminol is used, luminol is also a liquid substance?
It is a chemical that is sprayed on that is, yes, liquid.
And that could further dilute the blood that was left behind and cleaned up.
That's correct.
So you need luminol or phenolphthalein to detect blood, but at the same time, detect blood that's not visible.
Luminol is used to detect the non-visible blood.
So it's being used to detect non-visible blood, but at the same time, since it's the liquid, it's also adding to the dilution of the substance.
Yes.
You tell the jury, what do you do when you receive items that have tested presumptively positive for blood at a crime scene? In terms of your serology examination.
If they've tested positive for luminol at a crime scene, we will automatically retest those swabs in the laboratory with our chemical test of phenolphthalein to determine whether or not blood is present.
And how does that work in terms of the process?
The swabs are submitted to the lab, and a tiny cutting is taken from the swab. Again, there's no visible blood on the swab when it's a luminol reaction. A small cutting is taken, and that cutting is what is tested in the lab for phenolphthalein to determine whether or not blood is detected on those swabs.
Is that best practice when doing this kind of testing?
Yes.
Do you always receive the actual item of evidence itself?
We may receive an item of evidence, or we may receive swabs that were collected on scene when the item of evidence cannot be collected from the scene.
Let's say you and I are discussing a murder case involving someone being shot in a car. Do you receive the car, or do you receive swabs from the crime scene?
The crime scene personnel would have processed the vehicle and collected swabs from the vehicle itself, and the swabs would be submitted to the laboratory.
We're going to move now to talk with the jury a little bit about DNA analysis, okay? You're the first of three witnesses who are going to talk about DNA, so I'm going to ask you to get a little more into the background of DNA, if we can do that. Can you just briefly explain to the jury what DNA is?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and they're the genetic building blocks that are present in every cell in the human body. They're unique to every individual other than identical twins.
Where is it found in the human body?
In all cells in the human body. The common ones that we are targeting would be blood cells, to get DNA from blood stains, seminal fluid. We also do DNA on what we call trace samples, which would be skin cells, sweat cells, saliva.
And what are the procedures used to conduct DNA analysis?
We apply chemicals to either a swab or a stain that we are trying to develop a DNA profile from. Those chemicals break open the cells and pull out the DNA from the cells. We then do what we call a quantitation, where we estimate the amount of DNA that's present in that particular sample. And then we do a process that's called Pcr Technology, and that stands for Polymerase Chain Reaction Technology. And that is a technology where we zoom in on different locations of the DNA molecule, and we create hundreds of thousands of copies of those different locations using a manufactured kit. That amplified sample, is what we call it, is placed onto an instrument where we eventually get a graphical depiction of an individual's DNA profile.
During the course of your career, has DNA analysis changed?
It has gone through many iterations and many advances in the 18 years that I've been exposed to DNA.
Can you just give us a brief overview of that?
The kits have changed. The kits have become more sensitive. When I originally started doing DNA, we had two separate kits, that it was more challenging to get our samples that have low DNA or trace DNA samples. The kits currently used in the forensic field are much more sensitive than the ones that I started out with back in 2005. And we are able to obtain DNA profiles from much less DNA, and we are able to obtain mixtures from what we call trace samples of very low-level DNA samples, and we are able to do interpretations on some of those types of samples.
And has DNA analysis, in fact, changed during the pendency of this investigation and prosecution, which started in 2012?
Yes, it has.
So the testing you did that you're going to testify about today was using tools and methods when you were working on the case between 2012 and before you left CBI.
That's correct.
As part of your work, do you normally compare DNA profiles developed from crime scene evidence to known samples that have been submitted to the lab?
Yes, and that is where we determine whether or not an individual may match a sample from a crime scene.
What do you mean by a match?
If we look at the graphical depiction or the DNA profile from the crime scene sample, and we do a visual comparison to the reference samples that are obtained in the case, and we determine whether or not they are the same profile at each of the different locations that we're looking at.
When you have a match, what does that tell you?
That that DNA profile was contributed by that particular individual, and we do a statistical calculation to provide weight to that profile.
I'm just going to ask you to break that down a little bit. You say DNA profile was contributed. What do you mean by contributed?
That individual DNA is in that sample or is that sample.
And then the statistical analysis, what do you mean by that?
We put the DNA profile from the question sample into it's a software that is utilized to give us the rarity of that profile in the general population.
Are you able to determine, let me back up one step, I'm sorry. What factors go into whether a DNA sample is going to be left behind? In other words, what factors in terms of surfaces, different fluids, can determine whether DNA is going to be found at a crime scene?
Again, that's part of the serology process where we're looking for body fluids that may be leaving a DNA profile. We can also do DNA on what we call trace samples. So if we're trying to identify the wearer of a particular item, we can swab that item to try and find the trace DNA.
Forgive me for the poorly worded question there. So trace DNA, I'd like to talk to you about that for a couple minutes, okay? So let's say I come over here and I put my hand on the shoulder of the bailiff. Will you find my DNA on the shoulder of her blouse?
It is possible for us to pick up your DNA from her shirt.
What are the factors that might determine whether my DNA is going to be left behind on her shirt or not?
It depends on how long you were in contact with that item of evidence. It may depend on the time frame, if the item was washed prior to us trying to obtain or swab to obtain a profile. All those factors come into play. Environmental factors will come into play as well that can affect whether or not we can obtain a DNA profile.
Are some surfaces better than others for obtaining DNA evidence?
Yes, they are.
Can you tell the jury about that, please?
Hard surfaces where you have a liquid or a body fluid, you're more likely to obtain a DNA profile from a known body fluid. Articles of clothing, it's going to depend on whether or not, again, the item was washed, if it had been exposed to elements, sunlight. Sunlight does degrade, UV light does degrade DNA, so that makes it more difficult for us to obtain interpretable DNA profiles.
So, hand on the shoulder, a couple questions for you about that. If she were to wash her blouse once or twice, what's the impact or likelihood that my DNA is going to be found on her shoulder?
Again, it's going to depend on how long you were in contact with the article of clothing. If it's washed numerous times after you're in contact with the clothing, the amount of DNA that you would deposit versus the individual whose shirt it belongs to would deposit is going to be very different. It's more likely that you're going to see the owner of the item of evidence DNA on it than foreign DNA if it's been washed numerous times prior to us attempting to obtain a sample for a DNA profile.
What's the reason you're more likely to see the owner's DNA more than you would my DNA on the shoulder?
Because it's in contact with their body much longer than it would be from someone who may briefly touch an article of clothing or an item of evidence.
You mentioned body fluids can leave DNA behind. What body fluids are you typically looking at?
We look for blood, seminal fluid, and saliva are the most common ones that we would look for, as well as skin cells, trace cells could be left behind to give us a DNA profile as well.
How do the body fluids compare to trace cells or skin cells in terms of evidentiary value or the ability to determine DNA analysis?
The body fluids are more likely to give us a interpretable full DNA profile. The trace DNA samples are always more difficult to obtain unless the person was sweating heavily or sweating profusely and has left a lot of DNA behind on a particular item. Sweat is not a visible body fluid. We can detect using an alternate light source, areas of fluorescence that may be better suited for leaving sweat cells or skin cells, but again, we can't see sweat cells or skin cells.
So just to drill down on that, I put my hand on the table here, or I cut myself and put my hand here and there's blood left behind. Which would you expect to find a more rich source for DNA analysis?
From the blood stain.
Why is that?
Again, it's a body fluid that has a visible stain that's going to more likely provide me with more DNA in that sample than a area that is just swabbed. The area that is just swabbed, if it's a common area that has been touched by many people, we may end up more with a mixture as well.
Are you able to determine from DNA analysis how a DNA sample was left behind?
No, we are not.
Are you able to determine when a DNA sample was left behind?
No, I can only tell you that the DNA is deposited there and who the DNA is coming from, but not when it got there or how it got there.
Following the completion of your analysis, in any case, are reports generated?
Yes, they are.
And what is contained in those reports?
The items of evidence that were examined, as well as all of our results from the serology screening process through the DNA analysis.
And those reports in criminal cases provided both the prosecution and the defense, as well as law enforcement?
They are provided to the submitting agency, and the agency distributes it as they see fit.
And generally speaking, back when you were working at CBI, what were the turnaround times for evidence being submitted to you and you reporting out to the agency?
Generally several months.
So you receive items of evidence and it would generally take several months to provide the results in the report.
Yeah.
And what's the reason for that?
Just the backlog of cases that we had while I was at CBI, the number of items of evidence per case, and just the time frame involved in doing all the examination process all contributes to the turnaround time being several months.
Are there times where certain items of evidence are submitted to CBI and a rush is put on those?
Yes, there are many times we are asked to expedite the processing of items in particular cases.
And during the entire time you were working with CBI, CBI was an accredited lab?
That is correct.
When you have DNA left behind at a scene, you talked about how you can't determine when it was left there.
That is correct.
Can additional information help you determine when it may have been left there in terms of a range of time?
No, again, if an individual has been at a location and an item is submitted, we can't determine if it was, placed there 2 years prior or if it was currently put there, if they're known to have been at that particular location at various times.
That's not part of your analysis.
That is correct.
But if you were to learn that, let's say, I've never been to the court reporter's house before, but she invites me this weekend, and then my DNA, and that's the only time I've ever been there, and then my DNA is found there, would you be able to approximate the time that the DNA was left behind?
If an individual has never been known to be at a location and their DNA is found after an alleged incident, the assumption would be that, yes, it was deposited there when they were there.
And that would be, again, information from other parts of the investigation.
That's correct.
With regards to the investigation into the disappearance of Dylan Redwine, did you receive swabs with regards to this case?
Yes, I did.
And did you examine swabs submitted from the scene for the presence of human blood?
Yes, I did.
Did you also process those swabs for the presence of DNA?
I did take those forward for DNA testing.
Can you tell us, before we get into the results for the jury, can you tell us the process that you followed when you first received swabs?
Those swabs would have been retrieved from our evidence custodian, and I would have opened each item separately and screened them with phenolphthalein to screen them for blood.
And if a swab tests positive, as having blood, do you then test it for human DNA as well?
That sample would have been prepared for DNA testing and taken forward for DNA.
And what if a swab had reacted at the scene? In other words, luminol indicated it was presumptively positive for blood, but then it gets to the lab and you don't find it to be positive for blood. Do you still forward it for DNA analysis?
In this particular circumstance, I did, because I was aware that luminol was used at the scene and the circumstances for the items that were submitted. So those items were still forwarded for DNA testing.
You receive evidence in regards to this case starting on December 5th, 2012, and then again on December 10th, 2012.
I can refer to my report.
Please do.
Yes, there was items submitted December 5th of 2012 as well as December 10th of 2012.
And did you conduct, as a first step, examinations for blood on the swabs that you received?
Yes, I did.
Where was blood found, based on your analysis?
There were swabs from a love seat couch cushion from room B that were positive for the presumptive presence of blood in the laboratory. There were swabs that were collected from the floor under the rug near the coffee table of room B that were also positive for the presumptive presence of blood. There was a swab from a pipe near the washing machine in room L that was positive for the presumptive presence of blood. And there was a swab that was submitted from the coffee table of room B that was tested presumptive positive for blood.
And each one of those test results were the test results that you generated through the process of the lab?
The screening process that I tested in the lab, yes.
Just to be clear, the love seat, south cushion, room B, that's item 2.
That's correct.
Floor under the rug by the coffee table is item 3.
That is correct.
Pipe near the washing room, item 4.
Yes.
And the swab from the coffee table is item 6.
That is correct.
And each one of those in the laboratory indicated the presence of blood.
That is correct.
What does that mean?
The sample that I took from the swab to test for blood using our phenothalene, our chemicals that I use in the laboratory, gave me a positive reaction for the presence of blood.
Then there was item 1, which was the east cushion. What was the testing results at the laboratory for the presence of blood?
There were 2 swabs. Item 1 was 2 swabs from the couch, the east cushion from room B. The presumptive testing in the laboratory was negative for the presence of blood.
And item 5?
Item 5 were 2 swabs from the floor in front of the love seat, south cushion in room B, that also tested negative for blood in the laboratory.
And under the process you've already described for item 1 and item 5, did you still forward them in the process of DNA analysis?
Yes, I did.
So we're going to go through the DNA analysis and those results. Regarding the buccal swabs that you talked about earlier, what if someone's missing? In other words, someone's missing, you can't get a buccal swab from that person. What do you do to develop a DNA profile?
We recommend if there is either baby teeth that are left from an individual, we could use a toothbrush as a secondary standard from a missing individual. If you have items that individual may have been the only person that used, chapstick, lipstick, we can use hairbrush. Hairbrush is not the best to use because sometimes more than one individual uses a hairbrush. But we can also use a hairbrush as a last resort if we don't have any of the more common items that would be used by one individual: toothbrush, baby teeth.
So in this case, what was used to develop the DNA profile of Dylan Redwine?
There was a baby tooth that was submitted to the laboratory that was belonging to Dylan Redwine that was processed, as well as a tube of lipstick that was taken from his drawer with the assumption that he was the only individual that would have used that tube of lipstick.
Anything else? that was submitted to CBI by the family of Dylan Redwine in Colorado Springs for your analysis?
There was some mouthwash that was also submitted to the lab that was taken from his bedroom.
So the family from Colorado Springs submitted baby tooth Blistex mouthwash.
Was given to the sheriff's office to submit to the laboratory.
You may.
Ma'am, I've handed you what's been previously marked for identification as Peoples 12. Do you recognize what that is?
Yes, I do.
What is that?
This is the baby tooth that was submitted to the laboratory for testing.
And how do you know it to be the same baby tooth that we've been discussing thus far?
It has the CBI evidence label with the case number as well as my initials, the case number, the date that I examined it, and then it is also, following our examination, we seal an item of evidence after we've processed it with the blue tape with our date and initials.
And does that appear to be in the same or similar condition as to when it was processed by you at the lab?
Yes, it does.
Your Honor, at this time, people move Peoples 12 into evidence.
Mr. Bogan?
No objection.
J12 is in?
Your Honor, may I approach the evidence that's in front of the witness stand?
Yes.
Thank you.
You may.
I've provided you with Exhibit 11, which is already in evidence. What is number 11?
Number 11 is the tube of Blistex that was submitted to the laboratory.
And that also appears to be in the same or similar condition as to when you analyzed it in regards to the disappearance of Dylan Redwine.
Yes, it is.
And the Blistex and the baby tooth were submitted to the lab because at this point, Dylan Redwine was still missing.
That is correct.
What did you do to develop the DNA profile of Dylan Redwine using those items?
The Blistex tube was swabbed, the portion that you would rub on your lips, with cotton tip swabs in order for me to attempt to develop a DNA profile. The baby tooth was crushed so that we could get it in a different form in order to attempt to pull out DNA from the baby tooth. And a portion of that crushed material was taken forward for DNA analysis.
What's the reason you have to crush the baby tooth to do that?
Again, we need to put it in a different form so that we can release the DNA cells from the tooth.
Where are the DNA cells within someone's tooth when it's provided to you in this fashion?
It's in the pulp area of the tooth and the root, so we are trying to get the DNA out of that part of the tooth.
You said you forward part of it for DNA analysis. What's done with the other part?
The other part is preserved, and it is in the DNA packet if additional testing needed to be completed on that portion.
You also received buccal swabs from individuals who are still alive in regards to this case.
Yes, I did.
And who are those individuals?
Ms. Elaine Redwine, Mr. David Stone, Mr. Mark Redwine, and Mr. Corey Redwine.
Were you able to identify, or excuse me, develop DNA profiles for each one of those individuals?
Yes, I was.
How'd you do that?
Again, through the DNA process, I was able to develop profiles from those individuals.
Your Honor, can I approach with what's been marked as Peoples 340 for identification?
Yes.
And previously provided to counsel. Thank you. Do you recognize Peoples 340 for identification?
Yes, I do.
What is that?
It is a diagram of the crime scene, listing the samples that were collected at the scene and submitted to the lab for analysis.
Does it include the results that were generated as part of your analysis for forensic serology, and forensic DNA analysis?
Yes.
Did that aid you in your testimony here today?
Yes.
Does it appear to be an accurate representation of your results regarding the forensic serology and forensic DNA analysis?
Yes, it does.
Your Honor, at this time, move Peoples 340 into evidence, please.
Mr. Bogan?
Essentially a self-serving police report, Judge, with pictures. Objection.
Response?
Your Honor, yesterday the jury was provided a exhibit which contains the same photographs and captured Joe Clayton's work on the case. This builds off of that and will allow this witness, Ms. Strub, to show the jury the results of her work on those same items of evidence. It contains, just for the record, the photographs as well as the results that she's going to be testifying to, and it's nothing outside of the work that she did on this case.
Let me look at it just a second.
Yes, Your Honor.
So we are talking about a considerable amount of evidence in this case. Are you asking this be adopted, introduced as a summary, or what do you see?
The summary for this witness, Your Honor, will allow her to show the jury as opposed to just talking at length about what the results were and where they were taken from. These are all results that she's going to be discussing and testifying to. She was directly involved in the DNA analysis and serological examination.
As long as the results that she testifies to are what's contained in the summary, which I assume is what's going to happen, it'll be admitted. So I'll admit it with that understanding that you have to tie it all up.
Yes, Your Honor. Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, with that, with the court's permission, I'd like to publish 340 for the jury.
You may.
Judge, I'm going to ask to move where I can get closer to the screen.
Oh, yes. And it might be close to time to taking a break. Are you going to be going in this area for quite a while?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, why don't we do that now then? Let's start up again at 10:15. Please remember my admonition is not to talk about the case. And everybody rise for the jury. Okay, we'll be in recess.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, I assume Ms. Strub can step down.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Your Honor.